Be inspired, supported, and empowered. This is the Global Healthy Living Foundation Podcast Network.
You're listening to Healthcare Matters, the podcast that pulls back the curtain to help you make sense of complex healthcare economics and policy issues. With us is Dr. Robert Popovian in Washington, D.C. He's a pharmacist, an economist, and the Chief Science Policy Officer at the Global Healthy Living Foundation.
Joining me is my very good friend Ben Blanc from the Hoosier State, Indianapolis, Indiana, and our Associate Director of Digital Production and Engagement. Ben, I don't spend as much time as you're much younger than me, on the social media platforms, but there's this new gastronomic trend that's been going on, and my kids actually mentioned it to me. What is this thing in social media, the cookies?
Okay, Robert, well, we haven't even started the episode, and you're already getting me all fired up. I mean, combining a croissant and a cookie together, honestly, it sounds more like a marketing push than a successful culinary achievement. It seems like an impossible marriage to me, kind of like if PBM suddenly decided to work for the benefit of patients. Sounds like a great plan on paper, but we know that's not going to work. Well, that's the same thing for your cookies.
Well, certainly I can't argue with you on that issue, and I'm sure as a Frenchman you're not very happy that croissant is being taken advantage of in this such manner. But we have a guest today, and our guest is probably wondering if she joined the right podcast at this point, because she's wondering, why am I invited to a discussion on social media issues? We have a much more serious issue we want to discuss with you today. Kate Hudson is our guest. Kate, you are the Associate Vice President and Counsel for Government Relations and Public Policy at the Association of American Universities.
And today's topic is at the intersection of innovation, policy, and patient care. So welcome to the complex world of marching rights. Thanks for joining us, Kate.
Thank you for having me.
So, Kate, we always start our episode with a key number that relates to the episode's topic. And today, Robert, that number is 75%. Can you tell us what this number means?
Well, it's not definitely the growth in the GDP of 75%, but it's basically 75% is from a study that was published in 2019. I believe it came out in JAMA or New England Journal of Medicine, but it was done by Harvard researchers that looked at the regards to FDA, Food and Drug Administration approvals between 2008 and 2017. And what the researchers found was that 75% of all the approved medicines were solely funded by the private sector funding, and that only 19% of approved had origins in the publicly supported research and development, and 6% originated in companies that spun from publicly supported research programs. So in other words, 25% of approved medicine benefiting from some public support. The rest, the 75%, was coming from the private sector funding primarily.
Well, lucky for us, we have an expert on the podcast today.
And we do. And Kate and I met a few months ago. We were talking about different issues in a symposia that was done in Washington, D.C. And I really liked what she had to say, and I wanted her to be on this podcast. So before we get started, Kate, can you share with us a little bit about yourself, your professional journey leading up to your current role at the Association of American Universities?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And it was really great meeting you at that event and getting to talk about Marchin. And so thank you so much for the opportunity to continue to talk about Marchin today on your podcast. So again, I'm Kate Hudson. I work for the Association of American Universities, which is a 124-year-old association here in Washington, D.C. I currently represent 69 U.S. and 2 Canadian R1 research institutions. That's R1 on the Carnegie scale. So those are your top-level research universities. My member institutions are those institutions that receive kind of the lion's share of federal research dollars and also represent the vast majority of patents coming off of university campuses as well. Prior to joining AAU as Policy Counsel and AVP for Government Relations, I spent about 7 years in the federal government as a federal attorney. I did both regulation and policy, as well as litigating on behalf of the government in a really wide range of matters. I served for 3 years as agency counsel on the OPM China cyber breach case. And that was a really incredible case to work on, but you learn a lot about government regulations and internal machinations and how things actually work inside of higher levels of government. Before that, I was an attorney in North Carolina and Georgia, and I worked in the legal services space, and I was an assistant public defender. Prior to law school, I worked for the American Hospital Association. That's where I got my start here in Washington. And so I can tell you, my portfolio at AAU itself is pretty wide-ranging. I advise on a myriad of issues as policy counsel relating to intellectual property, technology transfer, export controls, SBIR, STTR, Title IX, First Amendment issues, some other things that are happening right here in Washington that universities are very much a part of right now. Federal research funding as well. I help our other staff members talking about how to get Congress to commit to greater levels of appropriations for those federal science agencies so that they will fund the research that is performed by my member institutions.
Well, Kate, it definitely sounds like you are the right expert for our deep dive into today's topic. In this discussion, we'll shed light on something called march-in rights. So, Kate, could you explain what march-in rights are and why they are of significant concern to the Association of American Universities?
Absolutely. So when we say march-in, that doesn't make sense to a lot of people. It's a term of art. It comes from a portion of the Bayh-Dole Act. So this was a major piece of legislation that was enacted in 1980, sponsored by Robert Dole and Birch Bayh. It was passed on a bipartisan basis and signed into law. What the Bayh-Dole Act does is it creates the legal infrastructure around intellectual property when that intellectual property is a result of federal research that is performed by either a university or a small business. And so my universities, in addition to many other universities in the higher education space, we perform fundamental research funded by the United States government. We perform it whether something comes out of it or not. We are doing that subject to federal research grants. We perform that research. And then if there is intellectual property in the form of a patent, for example, that derives or is a result of the research performed under those research agreements, the intellectual property is allowed to stay and be held by the university. Before 1980, the patent reverted to the federal government and sat on the shelf here in Washington, D.C. After 1980, the Bayh-Dole Act allows for that IP to then be commercialized and licensed to a private sector partner with the university to take it through the research and development phase towards, hopefully, fingers crossed, commercialization. And so the Bayh-Dole Act is what changed that legal paradigm. And that is a piece of seminal legislation that's been running in the background, basically, for the last almost 44 years now. It'll be 44 years in December. And so it's been running in the background. It has really converted the U.S. economy's ability to capitalize on those research advancements and discoveries that are made on university campuses that are funded through federal research dollars. When we talk about march-in is a specific component of the Bayh-Dole Act. And march-in is, think of it like an emergency release valve. So it's put in place in case of emergency, basically. In case someone who has licensed a technology is refusing to do anything with it. So think of hypothetically, you are an incumbent in a market space and you know about a discovery that's been made on a university campus and you license that patent towards commercialization from the university, but then you actually sit on it so that it will not eventually become a competing product, right, to compete with your own since you are the incumbent in the market. Under march-in, that is a specific instance where the licensee is refusing to commercialize, right? And they're just sitting on it. And march-in allows the federal government to march in. That's where we get the term, to march in and create a compulsory license for another licensee. The intellectual property remains with the university, but the federal government is basically making a compulsory license to someone else because of the conduct of the original licensee. There are criteria under the Bayh-Dole Act, very, very specific criteria. There are 4 instances where march-in can be exercised. It has never been exercised. There have been petitions for march-in, but it's never so far been exercised in the 43 years since the bill's passage. But march-in rights are the rights that are held by the government to do that in circumstances where it is warranted by the conduct or public emergencies that are happening in the American space.
Well, thanks for breaking that down for us, Kate. It's all very clear. I think you really highlighted the stakes involved here. Now, Robert, you are the Senior Health Policy Fellow at the Progressive Policy Institute, and you play a lot of other important roles elsewhere too. And one in particular I want to highlight here is that you also sit on the board of directors of University Pharmco. Could you explain University Pharmco's mission and give us your perspective on marching rights?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Other things I do is also I sit on the board of directors for University of Southern California, or board of counselors for the University of Southern California School of Pharmacy. Some of the board members and I have decided to start a company called University Pharmco about 3 years ago. And the purpose of this company was to really take a look at the research that was being done at the USC School of Pharmacy, and then beyond that, perhaps the School of Medicine, but specifically with the School of Pharmacy, and see if we can get those molecules that the researchers are working on to sort of gain funding from the private sector or the public sector for further research and further advancements. Most of these research that's being done is basic science research at the labs, and our intent as a company was to take this stuff, try to commercialize or raise funding for it, so eventually, as Kate mentioned, fingers crossed, it would eventually end up in a patient's bedside as a molecule. And the revenue generated from that molecule, obviously because of what Kate discussed, will go primarily towards the university and to fund the university's scholarship programs and helping with the student tuitions and things like that. So I'm very well aware of what the mission of the universities are with regards to research. In fact, I'm part of a company trying to do this thing. And believe it or not, the marching rights is something that we have discussed extensively, the Board of Counselors level and as well as the University Pharmco Board of Directors level, because it is something that, if it happens, it really has a chilling effect on our ability to then get molecules funded for further research and get these molecules that exist in laboratories, in vitro, in test tubes, and really into clinical trials and human trials. And eventually, as we mentioned before, fingers crossed, into the patient's bedside as cures and drugs that really affect patients' lives. So that's the mission of University Pharmco. That's the mission of most universities that exist. And we're not unique at University of Southern California, where I work with these individuals. A lot of other universities do similar things. And the purpose is really to help bring these important research eventually to the patient's bedside.
Well, thanks, Robert. And I think it's really great to hear both of your perspectives on this. Kate, considering GHF's patient-centered audience, let's explore why this matters to them. So circling back to what you explained and building on it, from a patient's standpoint, why is the conversation around marching rights so critical?
Right. So why are we talking about this right now? Of all times, right? You know, the law has been around for a very long time, 4 decades now. Why are we all of a sudden talking about marching, and why are we concerned about it? In December of last year, NIST, which is the government agency that is responsible has the authority over the regulations governing the Bayh-Dole Act, delegated by Congress, they released what they're calling a draft guidance framework for decisions about when agencies can or should exercise march-in rights. This was not put out as a notice of proposed rulemaking. This was very much touted as a way to control drug prices coming out of the executive branch as a whole. This was very much touted as an accomplishment, as a really legitimate way for the government to reach in and to exercise price control over what some people in this space view as the government's right to do so, since it was funded already. Right? The government already funded the development of this drug, so we should be able to control the price, right? That's how the faulty logic kind of works with this. And so that framework, that proposed framework for decision-making coming out in December, is what has really set off just an absolute firestorm of debate and discourse on the exercise of march-in rights. The way that this guidance was done and what the contents of the draft framework was itself is very, very worrying, and should be very worrying to patients specifically, because as Robert says, if marching is exercised in a way that is inconsistent with the law, to put it mildly, inconsistent with the original law, against the intent of Congress, and adding in subjective terms like reasonable pricing, it really will chill the research and innovation space around pharmaceutical research, like other types of life sciences research, diagnostics and therapeutics, all of these things. So it will put a chill in that. And why will it chill it, right? It's just a piece of paper. It's just a group of rules. It's just guidance. Why is it going to chill innovation? Because private sector partners have to be able to depend on the strength and predictability of the intellectual property that they are licensing. If they have any kind of uncertainty or are spooked about their potential investments, they're not going to license university technologies. They're just not going to do it. They're going to, say, there are other avenues that are safer areas for me to invest my capital, for me to share funding or grant equity. There are other mechanisms for me to invest this money, and they will not go towards those embryonic and nascent technologies that they are going to spend a ton of money doing further research and development to commercialize. They're just not going to do it. The capital will go elsewhere. And the result of that is that these research discoveries that are made on campuses like those of my member institutions, they will just sit in the lab. They will never leave. You would just not get another small molecule group. You just won't have it because it won't move. It will remain on the campus, on the lab, in the shelf. And we won't have this virtuous cycle that we currently have. And so it's all connected, and messing with one piece of the Bayh-Dole system really impacts the entirety of it. The discourse is so great around Marchin right now because the framework really imputes some very subjective terms and terminologies that are undefined, but that really throw a cog in the works. They're not a part of the original law. Congress specifically excluded things like basing a decision on reasonable pricing. It's in the legislative history. They specifically chose to exclude it, and now a new interpretation is being promulgated by people who really want to move towards a policy outcome of lowering drug prices. And it will just have such a hugely detrimental effect to the ecosystem as a whole, to the extent that you just won't continue to get these advancements through the further research and development process towards commercialization. So for patients, if you have a condition or a disease, does not have a developed treatment, or is currently still seeking a cure, this could really impact the future of finding a cure or finding a therapeutic for your condition. This will have that kind of effect. It's not overnight, but we will definitely be able to trace years from now the decline in the innovations coming off of university campuses if this framework is to be enacted and finalized through the federal government.
Thanks, Kate. And I think it's really important for our patient audience to hear that. You just mentioned how the guidance could chill innovation, at least on a domestic level. So let's keep talking about how this piece of legislation is impacting or further impact investment trends. Do you believe Marchin rights could skew private sector investment towards academia outside of the United States? And if so, how?
So the Bayh-Dole Act is actually such a successful public policy model that a version of it has been enacted in more than 16 other countries outside of the United States that have this kind of, like I said, virtuous cycle between their federal governments, their research institutions, and their private sector partners. There is potential for it to go outside of the United States. There's definitely potential. There's potential for the investment just to not go into this market at all, really. I mean, money spends, right? It doesn't necessarily have to go into life sciences research, but I think that when venture capitalists look at something like this, they're like, maybe I shouldn't get involved in this at all. But yeah, it could absolutely jump borders and be spent outside of the United States too.
Well, thanks for that global perspective, Kate. Now, Robert, let's pivot to a pressing issue in the U.S. healthcare landscape. Considering the rising drug prices in the U.S., what measures should we consider to address this trend?
Well, definitely not Marchin rights. There are other levers that we can pull, that we can institute, that really addresses the ever-increasing drug prices, but more importantly, the out-of-pocket cost pressure that is on the patients. There's at least 2, maybe 3 legislative efforts in Congress, both on the Senate and the House side, trying to create more transparency as well as some changes regarding the issues concerning the pharmacy benefit management companies. There are ability of patients, for example, to go outside the insurance model to purchase their medicines, especially generic medicines, through other efforts. Those are the things that we need to pursue. If you really are seriously interested in reducing drug prices and specifically the out-of-pocket cost pressure on patients, Marchin rights is not the answer. The answer is to really address the issue. So like sort of trying to address drug pricing through Marchin rights is like trying to address the global warming issue by reducing the carbon monoxide footprint of a single individual in Montana. It's irrelevant what that individual will do or not do. So we have other opportunities to do this. We have to take those opportunities instead of messing around with a very successful model that exists currently. And Kate is doing yeoman's work, and her institutions are doing yeoman's work regarding developing these molecules that one day they're going to create cures for a patient that is in desperate need.
Our conversation was really helpful to understanding the broader implications of Marching rights for research investment, drug pricing, and ultimately patient access to new therapies, like Kate mentioned. So, Robert, you have the last word. You're the expert. What sticks with you from today's episode?
Well, what sticks with me is a couple of things. Number one, majority of the funding, whether we agree with it, we disagree with it, according to research, the most recent research, majority of funding, 75% of all new medicines that are approved by the FDA are solely funded by the private sector. That is an important number because at the end of the day, if we start screwing around with marching rights and things like that, that percentage is even going to grow more. Because as Kate mentioned, as I discussed, there's a chilling effect for anybody to go and then invest for development of molecules to universities and things like that that have had federal funding. At the end of the day, investment is fluid. And Kate made another great point that possibly this investment in our American universities will go overseas to other universities and other countries that are not threatening this type of activity. Bayh-Dole Act has been extremely useful. And I will finish my thoughts with a quote from Francis Collins, who's the former director of the National Institute of Health, when he was talking about finding treatments for sickle cell disease specifically. And he said, "I can see an emerging pathway towards curing this disease using gene editing and bone marrow cells. But," and it's a big but, "it will take the full intelligence and resources and technology from the government, academia, and private sector to make it happen." The reason this happened, and this is the reason that Francis Collins said that, is because of the Bayh-Dole Act. And if we start screwing around with it, we will not have a possibility of finding these cures that patients are in desperate need. We need to have an objective look at the research and who's really conducting biopharmaceutical research, and that should inform our policy debates both today and in the future.
Well, thanks for breaking that down for us, Robert. I think that was some very valuable information for our listeners. Kate, thanks so much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that's it for us. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you might be listening so you never miss an episode. And if you have a second, help spread the word by rating our podcast, writing a positive review, and sharing with your family and friends. It will help more people like you find us.
If you have any questions, thoughts, or suggestions for us, you can send us an email at podcasts@ghlf.org. And we may include you in one of our future podcasts or your ideas in one of our future podcasts. So send us your ideas. We are always looking for new topics to discuss with you.
And before you go, make sure you take a listen to some of our other great podcasts on the GHLF Podcast Network. You can find all of GHLF's podcasts at ghlf.org/listen. He's Dr. Robert Popovian.
He's Ben Blanc. We'll see you all next time.
Be inspired, supported, and empowered. This is the Global Healthy Living Foundation Podcast Network.